The cold was a living thing. It had teeth that gnawed at the marrow of her bones, and a voice that whispered of endless, silent darkness. Alara had been born in the north, but this was a different kind of cold. This was the cold of stone and despair, the chill that seeped from a dungeon floor and promised a grave. She drew her knees to her chest, the thin rags of her tunic offering no comfort. Her breath plumed in the air, a fleeting ghost of warmth in a world that had none. They called her tainted. The brand on the inside of her left wrist was a constant, searing reminder. It was a jagged, ugly thing, burned into her skin on the day they'd dragged her parents to the pyre. Lord Valerius, the high advisor with a smile like a razor's edge, had declared their bloodline corrupt, their loyalties fractured. It had all been lies, elegant and cruel, but lies were the currency of the court, and her family had been left bankrupt. Now, she was the last of them, the last whisper of a name that had once been synonymous with honor. They'd let her live, a curious act of mercy she hadn't understood until now. A weed left to grow in the shadows was easier to pluck when the time was right. And the time, it seemed, was now. They had accused her of the same crime as her parents, practicing forbidden magic. It was a bitter joke. She had nothing. No power, no spark, no magic to call her own. The only thing that burned inside her was a hollow, aching grief. She was empty, a vessel scoured clean by loss. The scrape of a key in the lock was a shriek of iron that tore through the silence. Ilara didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this. Two guards, their faces grim and impassive under their helms, entered the cell. The torchlight threw their shadows against the wall, making them giants. "On your feet, Tainted," one of them grunted. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. She rose slowly, her limbs stiff and protesting. Every movement was an agony of cold. She expected them to lead her to the courtyard, to the same pyre or block that had claimed her family. But they turned the other way, deeper into the castle's frozen heart. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The second guard chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Lord Valerius has devised a special punishment for you, a great honor." He shoved her forward. "You're to serve the king." The words made no sense. The king. Kale. No one served the king. They feared him. They contained him. For a century, he had been a prisoner on his own throne, a beast bound in the highest tower of the citadel. "A curse," they whispered. "A monster born of a desperate battle that had saved the kingdom but shattered its savior." They climbed. The stairs spiraled upwards, each step leading them into a more profound cold. Frost didn't just cling to the stone here, it grew from it. Intricate ferns of ice that glittered like diamonds in the torchlight. The air grew thin and sharp, slicing at her lungs with every breath. This wasn't a place for the living. It was a tomb at the top of the world. Finally, they reached a pair of massive obsidian doors, etched with runes that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. The guards heaved them open, the sound groaning through the oppressive silence. They pushed her inside. The chamber was vast, a cavern of darkness and cold. High, arched windows were choked with ice, allowing only the faintest slivers of gray moonlight to penetrate the gloom. In the center of the room, upon a throne carved from a single piece of black, light-devouring stone, sat the Beast King. He was larger than any man she had ever seen, a giant of muscle and scars. His hair was a wild mane of silver-streaked black that fell past his broad shoulders. Thick obsidian chains, humming with a faint malevolent energy, bound him to the throne, snaking around his chest, his arms, his legs. But it was the cold that truly defined him. It radiated from him in visible waves, a shimmering aura of pure frost that distorted the air around him. And his eyes, they were open, and they were the color of a lake frozen to its very bottom. a pale, terrifying blue that held no warmth, no life, only an ancient, weary vigilance. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. Lord Valerius stood near the throne, draped in fine furs that did little to ward off the chamber's chill. His smile was as sharp and pleased as she remembered. "Ilara of the fallen house of Viron," he announced, his voice echoing in the dead air. "You are found guilty of consorting with forbidden powers, a crime against the kingdom." She said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Your sentence is not death," Valerius continued, savoring the moment. "It is service. You will be chained here, at the foot of the throne. The king's curse leeches the life from this place, from anyone left here too long. No one has ever survived a single night. Your tainted blood will serve as a distraction for the beast, a sacrifice to appease the curse and keep it contained within these walls." It was a death sentence, just a colder, crueler one. They were feeding her to the monster on the throne. The guards dragged her forward. She didn't struggle. What was the use? They locked a heavy iron cuff around her ankle, the other end of the chain bolted to the dais of the throne. The metal was so cold it burned her skin, a searing agony that shot up her leg. Valerius gave her one last triumphant look. "May the gods have mercy on what's left of your soul." They left. The great obsidian doors boomed shut, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the slivers of moonlight. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart. She was alone with the beast. She huddled at the edge of her chain, as far from the throne as she could get. The cold was overwhelming now, a physical pressure that was crushing the air from her lungs. She began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. This was it. This was how she would die, frozen to stone in the dark. Then a voice, deeper and harsher than the grinding of glaciers, cut through the silence. "They are fools." Ilara's head snapped up. The king was watching her. His frozen eyes held an intelligence, a clarity she hadn't expected. He shifted, the movement a colossal effort against his bonds. The obsidian chains groaned, straining against their anchors. With a sudden, explosive grunt of effort, he flexed the muscles of his right arm. The chain around his bicep didn't break, but the stone anchor it was bolted to shattered, spraying shards of rock across the floor. He was partially free. Terror, stark and absolute, seized her. He reached down, his massive, scarred hand easily grabbing the chain linked to her ankle. He pulled. The chain slithered across the floor, dragging her with it. She cried out, a small, helpless sound, scrabbling against the stone as he reeled her in like a fish on a line. She closed her eyes, bracing for the killing blow, for teeth and claws and the end of everything. She fetched up against the base of the throne, trembling. The cold coming off his body was so intense it was a physical blow. But he didn't strike her. He didn't tear her apart. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement, he shifted his enormous chained body. He curled his form around her, creating a barrier, a wall of flesh and muscle that shielded her from the ambient, killing cold of the room. He drew her into the hollow of his side, tucking her small, shivering frame against his torso. Lying against him was like pressing herself against a mountain of ice. His skin was unnaturally, impossibly cold. Yet somehow the direct, bone-leeching chill of the chamber lessened. He was a barrier, a shield. He rested his heavy head back against the throne, his wild hair brushing against her cheek. To her utter, complete disbelief, he let out a long, slow breath. His eyes slid shut. And he slept. Ilara lay there, rigid with shock, tucked against the side of the monster who was meant to be her executioner. He was using his own body to keep her alive. She didn't understand. She didn't understand any of it. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and her shivering began to subside, One impossible fact remained. The beast of the North Tower had curled around her, and he was protecting her. When the doors groaned open the next morning, casting a weak gray light into the chamber, Ilara was still alive. She was stiff, and the cold had sunk deep into her, but she was breathing. Kale, the king, was still curled around her, his breathing a deep, slow rhythm against her back. The faces of the guards were a mask of disbelief. Lord Valerius stood behind them, his smug expression crumbling into a scowl of pure confusion. "Impossible," he breathed. Kyle stirred at the sound of his voice. His ice-blue eyes snapped open, instantly alert. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through Ilara's entire body. It was the most terrifying and most comforting sound she had ever heard. The guards instinctively took a step back. "She lives," Valerius stated, his voice tight with frustration. "Leave her. The curse will take her eventually. No one can withstand the fading cold for long." The doors boomed shut again, and they were alone. A new routine, bizarre and unspoken, began to form. Every day, the guards would bring a single tray of stale bread and a skin of water, leaving it just inside the doors. Every night, Kale would break another piece of his prison, just enough to give him the mobility to shield her. He would pull her close, wrap his glacial body around hers, and sleep. Days bled into a week. Ilara learned the rhythms of her strange protector. He rarely spoke. His silence was a vast, ancient thing, filled with a loneliness that resonated with her own. She learned the way he would watch the ice-choked windows, his gaze distant, as if trying to remember the sun. The cold, she came to understand, was not just in the room. It was in him. It was his curse. Sometimes a tremor would rack his body, and the frost on the walls would thicken, crawling across the floor in delicate, deadly patterns. He was a man being slowly frozen alive from the inside out. One evening, emboldened by the strange safety she felt in his presence, she spoke. "Why?" she asked, her voice small in the vast chamber. His gaze shifted from the window to her. "Why what?" His voice was still a low rumble, but it held no menace. Not for her. "Why are you protecting me? They said you were a beast?" A long silence stretched between them. "The beast is the curse," he said finally, "not the man. And you are not tainted. I can feel it. There is no corruption in you, only sorrow." Tears pricked her eyes. He saw her. Beneath the brand, beneath the rags and the grime, he saw her. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ilara. Ilara," he repeated, the name a strange sound in his icy rasp. "I am Kale." He knew her name. He had given her his. It was a fragile bridge built across an impossible chasm of cold and silence. She began to talk, filling the oppressive quiet with stories of her family, of the home she had lost, of the lies Valerius had spun. He listened, his gaze steady and unwavering. He never questioned her. He simply believed. The arrangement deepened. He started pushing the tray of food towards her with his foot, nudging it until she had eaten her fill before he would take what was left. The gesture was small, almost clumsy, but it spoke volumes. It was an act of care. One night, a particularly violent tremor seized him. He cried out, a raw sound of pure agony, and collapsed back against the throne. A thick layer of frost instantly coated his skin, his lips turning blue. His breathing became shallow, ragged. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Ilara scrambled closer. She reached out and placed her small, trembling hand on his massive forearm. The cold was shocking, a pain so intense it was like a burn. But she didn't pull away. She held on, trying to rub some friction, some semblance of life, back into his frozen flesh. "Kale," she whispered desperately, "stay with me." Something happened. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. For a barest fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of warmth bloomed under her palm. It wasn't just an absence of cold, it was real heat. Faint, but undeniable. Kyle gasped, his eyes flying open. The violent shivering subsided. He stared down at her hand on his arm, his expression one of utter shock. He yanked his arm back as if her touch had been fire. "What was that?" he rasped, his voice tight. I don't know," she stammered, looking at her own hand in confusion. It felt normal, just cold. His gaze was intense, searching. For the first time, she saw something other than weariness in his eyes. It was a flicker of a long-dead hope, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a harsh resolve. "Do not touch me," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is dangerous. For both of us." The boundary was set, a line drawn in ice, but it was too late. Something had already crossed it. That night, when he pulled her against him to sleep, he held her a little tighter. His face was buried in her hair, and she heard him whisper a single word into the darkness, a word he thought she couldn't hear. Sunlight. Lord Valerius was no fool. The girl had been in the tower for over a month, and the reports from the guards were always the same. She was alive. Not just alive, but seemingly untouched by the fading cold that should have claimed her within hours. His perfect, elegant plan was unraveling. He needed to see for himself. He chose his time carefully, in the dead of night when the castle was asleep. He moved silently, a shadow in the halls, dismissing the guards at the obsidian doors with a wave of his hand. He slipped inside, his presence a ghost in the frigid chamber. What he saw made his blood run cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the curse. The king was asleep, his form curled protectively around the girl. Her head was pillowed on his bicep, her breathing soft and even. They looked peaceful. It was a scene of impossible, monstrous tenderness. Valerius's mind raced. This wasn't just survival, this was a connection, a bond. The tainted girl wasn't just a sacrifice, she was a threat to his ambitions, a variable he could not control. He saw the way the remaining chains on the king were strained, how the anchors were fractured. Kyle was getting stronger, not weaker. Or perhaps, more accurately, he was finding a reason to fight the curse. Valerius began to weave a new tapestry of lies. He spoke in whispers to the other council members, his words dripping with false concern. The girl, he said, was a witch of formidable power. She had not been killed by the curse because she was feeding on it, drawing the king's power into herself. She was controlling him, bending the beast king to her will, and soon she would turn him upon the kingdom itself. Fear was a more potent weapon than steel. The council, already terrified of their cursed monarch, was fertile ground for Valerius's seeds of panic. They began to see Alara not as a victim, but as the kingdom's greatest threat. In the tower, Alara was blissfully unaware. Her world had shrunk to the cold stone, the slivers of moonlight, and the quiet, steady presence of the king. Cale's condition, however, was worsening. The periods of lucidity grew shorter, the icy seizures more frequent and violent. He was losing the battle. During one such episode, he thrashed against his chains, his eyes glazed over with a film of ice. He didn't seem to recognize her. A guttural roar tore from his throat, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Ice shot across the floor, encasing her chained ankle in a sheath of white. Panic seized her. This was the beast they all spoke of. But then she looked at his face, contorted in agony, and she saw not a monster, but a man in unbearable pain. "Cale," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's me. It's Alara." She defied his order. She crawled forward, the chain on her ankle cracking the ice as she moved. She reached out and took his hand. It was rigid, colder than stone, the knuckles white as he clenched it into a fist. She wrapped both of her hands around his, ignoring the searing pain of the cold. She held on, pouring all of her will, all of her desperate hope, into the contact. "Come back," she pleaded. "Don't let it take you." The spark ignited again. This time it was stronger. Not just a flicker, but a distinct pulse of golden warmth that flowed from her palms into his hand. It was small, but it was real. A tiny, defiant sun against an endless winter. Kyle's whole body shuddered. The icy film over his eyes cracked and vanished. He gasped, his gaze clearing as it focused on her. He looked from her face to their joined hands, where a faint orange light still seemed to glow under her skin. What was that?" he whispered, his voice raw with a mixture of pain and wonder. "I don't know," she confessed, her heart hammering. "There!" a voice boomed from the doorway. The obsidian doors had been thrown open. Valerius stood there, flanked by a dozen of his personal guard, their swords drawn. His face was a mask of triumph. He had been spying on them, waiting for this very moment. "You see?" he cried, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Ilara. "The witch's magic. She drains the king's life force for her own. She is killing him. Seize her." Rage, hot and immediate, erupted in Cale's chest. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the tower, he surged to his feet. Another chain, the one binding his left arm to the throne, shattered under the strain. He stood, stooped but menacing, a protective wall between Ilara and the guards. "Touch her," he growled, the words resonating with absolute power, "and you die." The guards hesitated, faced with the unleashed fury of their king, but the effort cost him dearly. His defiance was a final, desperate flare before the flame was extinguished. He staggered, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he clutched his chest. A web of black ice spread rapidly from his heart, crawling over his torso, down his arms. The fading cold, provoked by his exertion, was claiming him all at once. Valerius smiled, a cold, predatory expression. This was better than he could have planned. "It seems the king has made his choice," he said smoothly, "and it has destroyed him." Kyle's legs gave out. He crashed to his knees, his gaze locked on Ilara. The ice was creeping up his neck, stealing the color from his skin, turning him into a statue of his own agony. His last breath was a frosted whisper, her name a prayer on his frozen lips. "Ilara, run." Then his eyes went vacant. He was gone, a living sculpture of ice and despair, kneeling before his obsidian throne. The fight went out of her. Seeing him fall, seeing the life extinguished from those tortured eyes, broke something deep inside Ilara. The guards swarmed forward, no longer afraid. Rough hands seized her arms, hauling her to her feet. She didn't resist. Her world had just frozen over. "Take the witch back to the dungeons," Valerius commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "The king is incapacitated, a victim of her dark arts. As of this moment, I am assuming the title of Lord Regent. For the good of the kingdom." They dragged her away. She took one last look over her shoulder at the frozen form of her king, the only person in 100 days who had shown her kindness, now a monument to his own curse. The heavy doors boomed shut, and she was plunged back into the world of pain and iron and stone. The dungeon was even colder than she remembered. Or maybe the cold was inside her now, a permanent frost around her heart. They threw her into the same cell, the familiar damp and darkness a cruel mockery of her brief reprieve. For a full day, she didn't move. She lay on the stone floor, numb with despair. She had failed him. He had protected her, and in trying to help him, she had brought about his end. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her entirely. But beneath the grief, a different feeling began to stir. A slow, simmering heat. Rage. Valerius had twisted everything. He had used her. used Kale's curse, all for his own ambition. Kale had not been a beast. He had been a prisoner, a lonely, broken man who had seen her, truly seen her, and believed in her. He had called her sunlight. She would not let his story end like this. She would not let Valerius win. She sat up, the movement stiff and painful. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had sparked with impossible warmth. She didn't understand it, but it was all she had. Closing her eyes, she focused, not on the cold of the cell, but on the memory of Kale's touch, the shocking, absolute cold of his skin, and the answering, defiant flicker from within herself. She thought of her mother, humming by the fire on long winter nights. The songs were old, fragmented tales of the first kings, of mountain ice and sun fire, of a balance that had long been lost to the world. It had been nonsense to her then, a child's fairy tale. Now, it felt like a key. A soft scraping sound at her cell door startled her. It wasn't the heavy tread of the guards. A small wooden panel at the bottom of the door slid open, and a bowl of hot broth was pushed through, followed by a piece of soft, fresh bread. "Eat, child," a woman's cracked voice whispered from the other side. Ilara crawled to the door. "Who's there?" "An old friend of your mother's," the voice replied. It was Marin, the head cook, a woman who had served her family for years before their fall. "I know what Valerius did. I know he lied. Your parents were good people." A single tear traced a path through the grime on Ilara's cheek. "He's frozen. The king. It's my fault." "No," Marin said, her voice fierce. "It is Valerius's fault. He seeks to shatter the king and claim the throne for himself. He addresses the council at dawn. He means to make his regency permanent." Dawn. She had, until dawn. "The key to this lock is on a hook by the kitchens," Marin whispered. "The guards are celebrating their master's ascension. They are careless, drunk. Be the shadow your father taught you to be." The panel slid shut. Hope, fragile but fierce, ignited in Ilara's chest. She ate the broth, the warmth spreading through her limbs, chasing away the lethargy of despair. She was not tainted. She was not a victim. She was the daughter of House Viron, and she would not let a traitor destroy her king. Slipping through the castle was like moving through a ghost story. Her father, a man who had prized awareness as much as swordplay, had taught her the art of silence, of using the shadows. She moved like smoke, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floors. As Marin had promised, the guards were lax, their laughter echoing from the great hall. She found the key. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the lock of her own cell, freeing herself. Now she just had to get back to the tower, the highest, most guarded part of the castle. She climbed, not by the grand staircase, but by the narrow, winding servants' stairs hidden behind tapestries and within the thick castle walls. It was a maze of darkness and dust, but it kept her hidden. The air grew colder with every floor she ascended, a familiar, biting chill that told her she was getting closer. She reached the obsidian doors. Two of Valerius's personal guards stood there, their spears crossed. There was no way past them. Panic fluttered in her throat. She was out of time. Then she looked at her hands. She remembered the spark, the pulse of light. She closed her eyes and focused. Not on Kale, but on the guards. On her rage at them, at Valerius, at the injustice of it all. She imagined a tiny flame, a candle flicker in the palm of her hand. When she opened her eyes, a small ball of soft golden light was hovering over her palm. It gave off no heat, but it glowed with a gentle, mesmerizing pulse. Holding her breath, she nudged it with her will, sending it floating down the far end of the corridor, where it bobbed and swayed like a lost will-o'-the-wisp. "What was that?" one guard muttered. "Go check it out," the other ordered. As they moved away from their post to investigate the strange light, Ilara slipped through the doors. The chamber was as she had left it, but worse. Kale was still kneeling, a perfect statue of ice. But Valerius was there, standing before him with a massive iron warhammer in his hands. A handful of his most loyal men stood with him, their faces hard. "He was always a blight upon this kingdom," Valerius was saying, his voice filled with a theatrical sorrow that made Alara's stomach turn. "Cursed. Broken. A beast fit only for chains. This is not murder. It is a mercy. We are freeing him from his prison." He raised the hammer high, preparing to bring it down on Kale's frozen head to shatter him into 1,000 pieces. "Get away from him!" a voice cried out, raw and shaking, but echoing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. Her own voice. Valerius turned, his face a mask of fury and surprise. "The witch! How did you get out? Kill her, now!" His guards advanced, swords raised. But Alara didn't look at them. She had eyes only for Kale. She ran, ignoring the men, ignoring the threat of their blades, her entire world narrowing to the frozen man on the dais. She reached him. She threw her arms around his icy torso, pressing her cheek against his frozen chest. The cold was an agony beyond description, a force so absolute it felt like it was tearing her soul from her body. But she held on. "I will not let you die," she whispered, her tears freezing instantly on her skin. "You are not a beast. You are not broken. You are my king." She closed her eyes and poured every last ounce of herself into that touch. Her grief, her rage, her desperate, impossible love. She remembered his voice calling her sunlight, and she decided to become it. The world exploded in a silent, concussive wave of golden light. It erupted from her hands, from her heart, from every pore of her body. It was not fire that burned, but a pure elemental heat that gave life. A torrent of liquid sun that wrapped around Kale's body, sinking into the curse ice. The brand on her wrist, the mark of the tainted, sizzled and vanished, leaving behind only clean, unblemished skin. The wave of power threw Valerius's guards back like dolls, sending them smashing into the far walls of the chamber. Valerius himself was thrown from his feet, the warhammer clattering across the stone. He stared, his face pale with terror and disbelief. "Sunfire," he choked out, the ancient words a death rattle. "It can't be." With a sound like a glacier calving into the sea, the black ice encasing Kale shattered. It didn't melt. It sublimated, turning from solid to vapor in an instant. Kale gasped, a great shuddering breath that was the first he had taken in a century, without the icy claw of the curse around his lungs. He looked down at Alara, who was still clinging to him, her small body radiating a light so bright it was hard to look at. Then he looked at his own hands, no longer pale blue but flushed with life. The frost was gone. The cold that had lived in his marrow for 100 years was gone. His eyes, no longer the color of a frozen lake, were a clear, deep, stormy gray. And they were filled with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Kale rose to his full, towering height. The last of the obsidian chains, weakened by the intense heat, melted and dripped to the floor in molten slag. He was no longer the beast of the North Tower, a monster bound to a throne. He was the king, standing tall and free for the first time in a century. He turned his gaze on Valerius, and the warmth that had filled the room was instantly replaced by a chilling, regal fury. "Treason seems to be a recurring theme in your dealings with House Viron, Valerius," Kale said, his voice no longer an icy rasp, but the deep, resonant boom of thunder. "Only this time, you were the traitor all along." Valerius scrambled backward, his face a mess of terror. "I did it for the kingdom. You were a monster." "You created the monster you wanted to see," Kale countered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Just then, the obsidian doors burst open. The castle guard, drawn by the commotion and the impossible light, flooded into the room. They stopped dead, staring at the scene. Their king, whole and unbound, the treacherous advisor cowering on the floor, and the small girl, glowing like a newborn star. Their allegiance, which had been swayed by Valerius's fear-mongering, snapped back into place with the certainty of a striking hawk. They saw their king, not their regent. "Seize him," Cale commanded. The guards needed no further encouragement. They swarmed Valerius and his few remaining loyalists. The fight, if it could be called that, was over in seconds. The chamber fell quiet. The only sounds the panting of the guards and the soft, humming glow that still emanated from Alara. The light was fading now, the immense effort having drained her completely. She swayed on her feet, her legs threatening to give out. Before she could fall, Cale was there. He swept her up into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. His touch was no longer cold, just strong and steady. He held her close, burying his face in her hair. "You saved me," he murmured against her scalp, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in 100 years. "You saved me first," she whispered back, her energy spent. He gently took her left hand, turning it over. He ran his thumb over the smooth, clean skin of her wrist where the tainted brand had been. "I never saw the brand, Alara," he said, his gray eyes locking with hers. "From the moment they threw you in here, I saw only the light you tried so hard to hide, the warmth you carried inside." He leaned down and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, soul-deep reverence. It was a kiss of warmth and gratitude, of promises kept, and a loneliness finally ended. It tasted of homecoming. When he pulled back, his hand came up to cup her cheek. "The old legends were true," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "The Frost-Heart King, his life bound to an ancient winter, can only be thawed by the return of a sun soul. My soul. I have been waiting for you for a very, very long time." She looked at him, truly looked at the man, not the beast or the king, and she finally understood. She was not tainted. She was not a curse. She was a cure. She was his. And in this frozen, violent tower, she had finally found her home. 3 months later, the kingdom was transformed. The unnatural winter that had held the northern lands in its grip for a century had broken. A warm, vibrant spring was sweeping across the mountains and valleys, a thaw so profound it felt like the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The people called it the Queen's Spring. From a high balcony of the citadel, Queen Alara watched the new green grass push its way through the last remnants of snow in the courtyard below. She was no longer dressed in rags, but in a simple gown of deep blue that matched the clear spring sky. At her side, King Cale stood, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He was no longer a chained figure in the shadows, but a vital, powerful ruler, his presence a source of comfort and strength for his people. Valerius was a resident of the deepest, darkest cell in the very dungeons he had once commanded. Stripped of his titles and his power, left to contemplate his treason in the cold and the dark. The families he had wronged, including Alara's, had their names and honors restored. Justice, it turned out, was not a fairy tale. It was simply a long and often difficult road. Cale leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "What are you thinking about?" "About how much has changed," she said softly. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. I expect to wake up on the floor of your tower." He turned her to face him, his stormy gray eyes soft. "That tower is a prison no longer. It is a monument. The place where my queen brought back the sun." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His skin was no longer cold, but held a pleasant human coolness, a perfect balance to the constant, gentle warmth that now radiated from her. They were mountain ice and sunfire, a harmony restored. "We have much to do," he said, his gaze sweeping over the capital city spread below them. Decades of Valerius's mismanagement and fear to undo. "We must rebuild, not just the roads and the granaries, but the people's hope." "We will," she said, with a certainty that she never would have possessed before. "Together." He smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his harsh, handsome features into something breathtaking. It was a sight she would never get tired of. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her as he had done on that first, terrifying night in the tower. But this was not a desperate act of protection against a killing cold. This was an embrace of love, of belonging. He rested his chin on the top of her head and asked, his voice a low, teasing rumble, "Are you warm enough, my love?" She tilted her head back, a smile playing on her own lips as she looked up at him. She was home. She was loved. She was whole. "Always," she replied, leaning into his strength, into their shared future. "With you, I am always warm."